Hey everybody, I've completed another solar orbit, so it's time to make a review for the occasion. This is Control, specifically Control Ultimate Edition, which is available for PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series S and X, and technically Stadia as well, although who cares about Stadia at this point. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a third-person shooter developed by Remedy Entertainment and published by 505 Games in 2019 for PC, PS4, and Xbox One, although in what will always be an immensely controversial move, the game was only made available on the Epic Games Store at the time. A year later, they did release it on Steam and GOG when the Ultimate Edition came out, which was also made available for Nintendo Switch, and it's also the version that you can get on PS5 and Xbox Series X and S. And even though I'm pretty sure none of you in the audience give even a single solitary crap about Stadia, it was released on that as well, and it should also be noted that the Switch version of this game is actually a cloud gaming version, not a native console version. Of course, I don't have that version, so I'm not really going to talk about it. What I have is the Ultimate Edition on PC. Now, what Ultimate Edition comes with is the base game along with both of its DLCs. And out of the two of those, which are the Foundation and AWE, I'm only going to be talking about the Foundation, because AWE ties in directly with Alan Wake, which I haven't played yet. So until I review Alan Wake, I'm not going to even bother going through the AWE DLC. What I did go through was the base game and the Foundation DLC, however, so that's what this review is going to be about. Anyway, apart from the controversy over the Epic Games Store exclusivity, when this game initially released, it was pretty well received across the board, and the PC version was notable for having ray tracing, which at the time was a very new tech, and it was generally seen as something of a killer app for ray tracing in general. Of course, you won't be seeing any ray tracing in this video because I don't have a graphics card capable of doing any ray tracing. I have a GTX 1080. That stuff wasn't made available until the RTX 20 series. And it really wasn't a viable tech until the RTX 30 series, which of course these days is basically unobtainium thanks to the current global situation. So I don't really think most people are going to care all that much about the ray tracing tech in the game and are really going to be more concerned with whether or not this is actually a good third-person shooter. And that's exactly what I was concerned with as well, especially after having played Quantum Break, which was Remedy's last third-person shooter, and Quantum Break was not a good game, but if you want to know more about that, just go watch my Quantum Break review. As for Control, well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and see what exactly we're dealing with here. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, although, as I mentioned before, I'm not going to be talking about any of the ray tracing stuff, other than it exists in the game, and if you want to know what that looks like, go look up some videos of the RTX stuff. As for the rest of the visuals, this game does run in the same engine that powered Quantum Break, and as such, you might be concerned that the performance would be pretty bad, because the performance was a very nasty issue in Quantum Break. Control, on the other hand, actually runs just fine. There are a few moments here and there where it does drop the frame rate a bit, but for the most part, this is running at a pretty smooth 60 frames per second or more, which is of course incredibly important for an action game. And in general, the visuals in the game are very well done. It's got some very good modeling and texture quality, and the particle effects are also quite good. The thing is that the game does tend to go a bit overboard on a lot of those, and a lot of that's for aesthetic reasons. You see, there's a whole lot of reality-bending stuff going on in this game, and while that does result in some incredibly cool to look at environments and some very cool supernatural phenomena happening, when you're actually in the middle of combat, there's a combination of all of the particle effects and the haze effects that are showing around the reality warping entities and such that make it kind of difficult to see what exactly you're doing a lot of the time. So that does end up being a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the particle effects and the haze effects and all the sheer carnage you're causing in the environments and stuff can be pretty impressive to look at, and does make the combat more satisfying, but that comes at the cost of making it much more difficult to ascertain what's going on in particularly hectic combat sequences. There are also some weird things going on with some of the post-processing effects, as well as the animations and the way that those two things intertwine, particularly with regards to the post-processing effects making everything look slightly hazy or blurry. And when you combine that with some of the animations, you end up with a situation where whenever it goes into more close-ups to have characters talk with each other, there's a noticeable divide between their face animations and the animations of their actual bodies. They clearly had some fairly intensive motion capture going on with the face animations, but that doesn't seem to be the case for all of the body animations, so you end up with situations where the face animations are a lot more detailed and more expressive, but their bodies are animating in a much more stiff and awkward video game manner, for lack of a better way of describing it. There was some of that in Quantum Break as well, but what it really reminds me of is LA Noire, where that technology was still pretty much unproven and was still being perfected, and the result in LA Noire was kind of laughable in a lot of ways. It's not quite that bad in Control, but occasionally it gives you that same feeling of, this just doesn't look right. Really, the game's visuals are at their best when you're focusing on things like the reality warping effects when they are applied to all of the brutalist architecture of the oldest house, as well as things like the amount of carnage that can happen in environments when you go through them and blast the living crap out of everything. And when you're focusing on things like that, the game's visuals can be very impressive. That said, there are some oddities here and there with things like the physics objects, a lot of which just don't seem to have all that much weight to them even though they really should. But that's really not a big deal when you're focusing way more on the action and all of the weird things happening around you. It should also be noted that there are some live actors taking part in FMV sequences throughout the game, although these are mostly in-game films that you'll run across. Things like various members of the Bureau talking about certain phenomena, or running through various procedures and things like that, and those are pretty well shot and pretty decently acted as well. So despite a few issues here and there, the visuals overall are quite well done, but what about the sound design? Well, the sound effects themselves get the job done and get it done pretty well. There are some fairly weak explosion sounds, but all of the gunfire and such like that works pretty well. There's also some quite good ambient noise that helps to give the game some more atmosphere as well. Then of course there's the voice acting, which is also quite well done. All of the characters are voiced rather well, and you will notice some voices that sound very familiar, especially if you've played other Remedy games. For example, the former director of the Bureau, Zachariah Trench, is voiced and acted in the FMV sequences by James McAfee, who you would know as the voice of Max Payne. The character of Dr. Darling is played by Matthew Peretta, who you would know as the voice of Alan Wake. And Courtney Hope, the actress who plays the main protagonist in this, Jessie Faden, will be familiar to you if you've played Quantum Break because she was Beth Wilder in that. Aside from familiar faces and voices if you've played previous Remedy games, however, the rest of the cast also does a great job. And funnily enough, it's one of the new faces that is arguably the most interesting character and performance in the entire game. That is the character Atti, who is played by the Finnish actor Martti Suosalo. And he just did a fantastic job of being this very strange but also very compelling supporting character that kind of steals the show in every scene he's in. So they've done a good job with the sound effects for the most part, and they've done a great job with the casting, but what about the music? Well, for the most part it's decent enough, and in the right moments it can be very atmospheric and have some tension ratcheting up for combat situations, but for the most part it is fairly simple and just tends to fade into the background. There are a few songs in the game that do stand out, however, notably the Finnish tango that's in the game and is actually sung by Martti Suosalo, as well as another song in the game by the fictional band The Old Gods of Asgard, which is an Alan Wake reference, but in reality it was performed by the Finnish rock band Poets of the Fall, and it's a pretty good song in and of itself, but the moment in which it comes up manages to make it even better. And when you bring all of that together, you end up with presentation that does have a few issues here and there, but because the aspects of the presentation that are done well are done really well, it's quite easy to put those issues aside. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as Jessie Faden, who starts the game off arriving at an office building that houses the Federal Bureau of Control, an organization she believes is responsible for the disappearance of her brother Dylan, who has been missing for the past 17 years. She arrives at the building to find it seemingly deserted except for the only person she encounters at first, the strange Finnish janitor Atti, who assumes she's there about the janitor's assistant job and urges her to go talk to the director about it. When she finds the director, she finds him shot dead on the floor, with the murder weapon sitting on the floor next to him, and the voice in her head that led her to this place to begin with tells her to pick it up, and once she does this, she is pulled into an alternate reality where she is contacted by something calling itself the Board, and they have her go through a series of trials which serve as the game's basic tutorial in order to determine her worthiness to wield what you now know as the service weapon. After completing the trials, she's brought back to her reality, and after exiting the director's office, is almost immediately attacked by Bureau personnel who have clearly been infested with something, which Jessie ends up terming the Hiss. And after fighting her way around, she ends up encountering other Bureau personnel who are not infected by the Hiss, and finds out that the building, which is called the Oldest House, is on lockdown after it was invaded by the Hiss, some sort of strange paranatural entity that has been infesting Bureau personnel, and if it's allowed to get out of the building, could cause untold devastation. Jessie also learns that having picked up the service weapon and been deemed worthy by the Board, that she is the new director of the Federal Bureau of Control, which it turns out is an agency that is meant to contain, study, and eventually gain control of various paranatural entities, which are basically things that break reality. In addition to learning that she is now the director, she learns that it is her responsibility to not just kick the Hiss back from whence it came, but also to then oversee Bureau operations from there on out. Thing is, she's not really interested in overseeing the Bureau's operations and doesn't really care what the Bureau's out to do. All she wants is to rescue her brother, and so that's what the majority of Control is about. Finding a way to stop the Hiss and saving her brother Dylan. It's a pretty straightforward premise, and if you look at the general progression of the story, you find that it is a pretty straightforwardly told story. It's just that all of the flavor around it, all of the strange supernatural things that you're running up against, make it a hell of a lot more interesting than its premise would imply. The plot ends up being more or less a framework for all of the other things that you're experiencing to happen in. You really find yourself much more concerned with what the Bureau is there to do, all the weird things that you're running up against, all these strange objects of power and altered world events and phenomena such as that, as well as all these odd characters that you keep running into and interacting with. All of that is far more interesting than simply Jessie trying to find her brother and stop the Hiss. And weirdly enough, when you do get to the end of the game, you find that the ending is actually quite weak. You don't have some big, epic boss fight at the end, you just have a fight against a bunch of waves of enemies, and then you interact with an object and it basically just ends. Then it basically deposits you back in the office and says, okay, well, you've completed the main story, but there's more stuff to do, and then you have an opportunity to go and do any of the side missions that you missed, or find the collectibles that you missed and such like that. Or when you have the Ultimate Edition, or have bought the DLCs extra if you had the very original release, then you have an opportunity to do the content for the Foundation and AWE DLCs. In fact, the ending of the game is so lukewarm that once it happens, you go, wait a minute, was that it? That the entire story? And it is the entire story, at least in the base game. The Foundation DLC does give you some extra plot in the form of there's something going on in the foundations of the Oldest House, and it's causing something that's potentially catastrophic to happen, so you need to go down there and fix it. And as you go about doing this, you are venturing into some of the deepest levels of the Oldest House, which haven't been looked into in a very long time. So it's basically an opportunity to learn some of the older history of the Bureau and help to flesh the organization and the setting out a bit more. And it does a very good job of that. And much like with the base game, it's much more about the journey than the destination, because the main story of the Foundation's DLC is just okay. It's not a particularly amazing plot, but it does a decent enough job of holding everything together that you can focus on the things that are interesting, all of the lore implications that the Foundation's DLC brings about. Because that's ultimately the thing about Control. The actual plot itself, both in the main game and in the Foundation's DLC. Not so sure about the AWE DLC yet, obviously. But at least as far as the main story of the base game and the main story of the Foundation's DLC, The stories themselves serve as a decent skeleton, something to hold it together, but it's really all the lore and the character interactions and the dialogue and such that make up the meat of what makes the writing in this game interesting. This is a very cool setting, and the more you learn about it, the more interesting it gets. So that's all well and good, but all of that is mostly told to you in either conversations, the videos that you watch that are either live action or puppets or something like that, or the audio logs or the documents that you'll find wandering around. And as interesting as all of that can be, it's all connected by the gameplay. So what is the gameplay of Control like? Well, it's a third-person shooter where you only get one gun, but it can be switched into multiple different forms, so you can have multiple effects, starting with a basic semi-automatic pistol form and moving up into things like a fully automatic submachine gun kind of thing, or a chargeable single-shot attack that will pierce through enemies and sometimes things in the environment, or something that will launch out explosive shots. You'll gain access to these different forms as you continue to progress through the game and gain access to new materials that will allow you to upgrade them as well. The materials themselves are just random drops from enemies, and you'll also find them in containers scattered around the areas. And as you continue to blast your way through enemies and complete missions and such, you will gradually earn a currency called Source, which is also used as part of these various upgrades. As you continue to upgrade the individual components of the service weapon, you'll also gain additional mod slots for it, up to 3 maximum. Mods are something else you'll find as you're wandering around, blasting your way through enemies, opening containers and such, and they're split into 2 types, weapon mods and personal mods. If it's a weapon mod, then it can either be just a universal one, like, say, increasing the rate of fire or something along those lines, or it can be form-specific, meaning that it'll only work on a specific form of the service weapon. So, for example, if you've got a mod that will increase the number of shotgun pellets that you're shooting out, it's only going to apply to the shotgun form, not any of the others. Personal mods, on the other hand, are related to your paranatural abilities and just your general effectiveness. So these will be things like increasing the rate at which your energy replenishes, or increasing the amount of health you have, or decreasing the amount of time it takes for a certain power to take effect, or reducing the energy cost of a particular power, or something along those lines. And regardless of which type of mod you're getting, whether it be personal or a weapon mod, the game gives you a ton of these, so eventually you're going to run out of space in your inventory for them, and you're going to need to start deconstructing them. This will free up a slot in your inventory and will also give you a small amount of source. And you'll have to be prepared to be doing this quite a bit, because not only does the game give them to you constantly, just from fighting enemies and also finding them in storage containers, you'll also get them as rewards for completing missions, whether it be main missions or side missions. And if that's still not enough for you, then you can take on board countermeasures missions, which are just side objectives that you'll be completing as you're wandering around doing stuff, and those will also give you a random mod as a reward. And as if that's still not enough, then you can also go into the Astral Constructs, and you can just purchase mods which are constructed at random using an amount of source as well as some resources. I don't really know why you would do that, though, considering that you'll be getting tons of mods as you're going through the game normally, and you'll probably be swapping them out on a pretty regular basis, because they have mod ratings from level 1 up to level 5, and as the level increases, obviously the benefit increases in potency as well. So if you find a mod that's a higher level version of one that you already have and have been using, there's no reason to keep the lower level one. You're just going to deconstruct the one that's lower level and just continue using the higher level one. As you go about your business, you'll be gradually gaining access to these other weapon forms and constructing them, and while you can only have 2 equipped at any given time and just switch back and forth between them as you're running around shooting stuff, you still retain access to the other forms and can go into your inventory to swap them out in your loadout. Regardless of which forms you're using, however, whenever you switch between a form, it doesn't change the amount of ammo you currently have. Ammunition is infinite in this game, but you can only shoot a limited number of times before the weapon has to recharge, and then once it's in its recharge state, then you can't shoot anymore until it's fully recharged. So it becomes a bit of a balancing act of shooting at enemies and making sure that you never fully run out of ammo so you don't have to go through that recharge cycle. The thing is, if all you had was the service weapon and whatever forms it can take on, then the shooting would get very repetitive very quickly, and thankfully they throw in some special powers that you have access to as well. These all operate off of an energy pool, and as you might expect, when you use a power, it will use up an amount of the energy pool, and then as long as you're not using any further powers, then your energy bar will recharge. And you gradually gain access to new powers as you continue playing through the game. And by the end of the game, you'll have access to a dodge power where you're able to dash out of the way of attacks and avoid damage, a launch ability where you can pick up an object in the environment, whether it be a chunk of wall or a table or whatever, and just throw it at a very high velocity at enemies, or sometimes just things in the environment that you need to throw things at. A shield ability that allows you to pull up a bunch of debris and have it floating in front of you so it can absorb damage, at the cost of not being able to do anything except maintain the shield while it's up. And then you can discharge the shield by launching it forward, and it'll do some damage to enemies in a short radius in front of you. And then finally an ability called Seize, where once you've damaged an enemy enough, then you'll see an indicator appear in front of them, and you can hold down the use key in order to take control of them, and then they will briefly fight for you. All of these abilities, except for the Levitate ability, which does not use energy, will all draw from the same energy pool, so much like with the service weapon where you have to maintain it so that you don't run out of the ammunition entirely so you don't go through the recharge cycle, the powers have a cooldown as well if you manage to bottom out your energy bar. There are ways to speed up your energy recovery, however. There are certain mods that will allow you to siphon energy from enemies when you melee attack them, and there's also various upgrades that you can get by spending ability points that will increase the rate at which you earn energy as well as the amount of energy that you have overall. In fact, all of your abilities can be upgraded using this ability point system. You'll get the ability points for completing missions, and then you can spend those points on upgrading your various abilities, which also includes your health, by the way. You can increase the amount of health that you have, which is important because your health does not automatically replenish. You'll probably have noticed throughout the video that as I'm blasting enemies that a bunch of blue lights are popping out of them. Those are health elements, and those are what you use to replenish your health. You see, the idea here is that instead of taking cover behind things with an active cover system or even a passive cover system, you'll be constantly running around the combat areas, and you'll be blasting the living crap out of enemies, and as you continue to defeat enemies, the health elements will be popping out of them, so any damage you take can generally be replenished in the middle of combat that way. Presumably this is to avoid the problem that a lot of third-person shooters have, where if they're cover-based, then a lot of the game is just spent hunkering down behind cover and just popping your head out, shooting at enemies for a bit, popping back into cover, popping back out of cover, etc., etc. Since you actively have to seek out the health elements in this, it makes the combat a bit more dynamic. You're going to be moving around an awful lot compared to a lot of other third-person shooters, which is definitely appreciated. The further you get into the game, the more you're going to notice that those upgrades become necessary, because enemies will become more resilient. They'll take more damage to bring down. They will also do more damage to you, so you need to make sure that your health is going up and that you're trying to avoid damage as much as possible. And that's on top of the variety of enemies increasing over the course of the game. You'll start off fighting just your basic grunts with assault rifles, and by the end you'll be fighting a good variety of enemies, some of which have shielding, some of which don't, some of which are very agile and can actually dodge out of the way of when you throw things at them, and others which can't. Some enemies will be very highly resistant to damage, whereas others won't. And while it's not an especially difficult game, there is some challenge in there, and if you're not paying attention, then the game will remind you of that. And while eventually the combat loop does get fairly repetitive and you'll find yourself settling into using basically only a couple of forms of the service weapon and really just relying mostly on throwing objects at enemies most of the time, the early period when you're starting out and don't have all that many powers and are starting to experiment with things is pretty interesting, and the combat loop itself is still pretty satisfying even though it does get repetitive because of the sheer amount of destruction in the environments that you're causing. I mean, you're ripping chunks off the walls and chucking them at enemies, machinery is getting thrown around and smashed apart, you're seeing stuff in office cubicles getting blasted up into the air, And it all helps to contribute to make it feel like you're doing a lot more damage than you're actually doing, because if you're paying attention to the enemy's health bars, then you're going to be noticing that you're not doing as much damage as you think you are, given all of the particle effects and such like that you're seeing. And thankfully the game's not quite long enough to where the combat really overstays its welcome. You're looking at around 9 to 10 hours of main story, with maybe a couple more hours of extra side content to mess around with, and that's not including the collectible hunting if that's your kind of thing. And for a third-person shooter, that's a pretty good amount of content. The thing is, it's organized in a way that is a bit of an odd choice for a narrative-driven game like this is. You see, as you progress through the game, you'll run across various control points, and then once you cleanse them or claim them, then they can be used to upgrade your abilities, as well as perform astral constructions, which will allow you to construct and upgrade various forms of the service weapon and such like that, and more importantly, they can be used as fast travel points. You see, the game requires you to do a fair bit of backtracking and go through areas that you've already been in order to experience some new things, and in that regard it's kind of like a Metroidvania, but the way it's organized is a bit more like a Souls-like, but without the mechanic of, say, losing all of your currency and then having to reclaim it whenever you die. Instead, whenever you die in this game, you'll lose 10% of whatever your current amount of source is, and then you can just earn that back by going around and blasting enemies and completing missions and such. It's not really the way I would think to organize a narrative-driven game, but considering that there are side missions and you can go back and explore and find collectibles and such, it does make some degree of sense. Either way, it really doesn't help the game out all that much. It basically just means that whenever you have to go back through an area, you'll probably have to fight enemies again because they've respawned, and if you've gotten new traversal abilities, then you might be able to find some secrets that you hadn't before, but other than that, there's not really much benefit to the way that the levels and the control points and such are structured. Thankfully, it doesn't really hinder the game all that much either, though, so it's a bit of a moot point there. It's also worth noting that both of the DLCs add their own sections to the oldest house. So with the Foundations DLC, you get the Foundations, which is the entire new area that you can explore and complete all the story missions for that in. And similarly, the AWE DLC introduces the Investigations sector. And while I do know that the AWE DLC also introduces a new service weapon form that allows you to shoot sticky grenades, I didn't mess around with that because I want to save that for when I mess around with the AWE DLC. As for the Foundations DLC, it introduces 2 new abilities, although you'll start out only being able to select one of them. These are Shape and Fracture. They allow you to manipulate the crystal formations in the various environments, and they are more or less what they sound like. Shape allows you to create new platforms using the crystals, so you can jump on them. It also allows you to create spikes on the ground, so when enemies run up towards you with that area of crystal in front of you, you can bring those spikes up and just impale them on them. And with the Fracture, you are able to shatter crystal formations, thus allowing you to access things that they were blocking off. Unfortunately, the powers are only integrated within the Foundations DLC. As you're running around that particular area, you'll have the crystal entities you can interact with these powers, but if you go back to any of the previous areas that were in the base game, then you won't find any use for them. So that's pretty unfortunate. It would have been interesting to see how they might have integrated these new powers into existing areas, but no, they only apply in the new areas. And as far as the other things gameplay-wise that the Foundations DLC does, it's more or less a microcosm of the general gameplay style of the base game, but also with some extra new enemy types, as well as the new powers, and of course all of the stuff that helps flesh out the setting more, which is really the star of the show there. That's all the really interesting stuff as you're going through this DLC. And for being included with the game, it's certainly a worthwhile addition to play through, especially considering that once you've finished the main story, and you get to the part where the game tells you that your work is not done and that there's all these side content to complete, it'll immediately give you the prompt for the new Foundation missions. And when you bring it all together, you end up with a game that does have a fair few issues, although none of them are particularly major issues in the grand scheme of things. Sure, the actual main plot isn't all that great, but everything building up around it is very interesting, so it doesn't really matter all that much. And sure, the combat does get repetitive after a while, But even with the DLCs included, the game doesn't overstay its welcome in that regard, so that also doesn't end up being that big of an issue. It's a solid third-person shooter with some action-adventure game elements thrown in for good measure, and between its great setting and all the strange reality-warping things that you'll be running into throughout the course of the game that you can't help but find interesting, it ends up being a very solid overall experience that is well worth playing, especially if you can pick up the Ultimate Edition on sale. As such, it overall lands somewhere between a 3.5 and a 4 on my scale. I'm going to go ahead and say a 3.5 because those issues do give me some degree of pause, and that's why I ultimately would recommend picking this up on sale if you're a bit more on the fence about it. I know I was definitely very concerned about this game after having played through Quantum Break and been extremely disappointed with it, but thankfully Remedy proved that they've still got it with Control. And I can't help but be curious where they take this series in the future and where they take the Remedy-connected universe in the future. Maybe we'll see more Alan Wake, maybe we'll see even more Control. I know that they're supposedly doing a sequel to this one, so it'll definitely be interesting to see where they take this in the future, but who knows where things will go from there. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.